The 17th of January 1943. The North Sea. 0437 hours. The darkness before dawn hung over the water like a shroud, thick and impenetrable. Oberleutnant Klaus Becker sat rigid in the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190, the instrument panel casting pale green shadows across his leather flight gloves. The engines of his Staffel hummed in formation around him, 12 fighters skimming just above the wave-tops, invisible in the pre-dawn blackness. They had done this 100 times before. Come in low, under the height where British searchlights could find them. Strike the coastal convoys at first light when the ships were silhouettes against the rising sun and the British fighters were still cold on their airfields. It was a proven formula. Becker could taste salt spray on his lips through the oxygen mask. In 90 seconds, they would climb, and the killing would begin. Then his radio crackled. Bandit, bandit, bandit. Vector 270, Angels 15, closing fast. The voice was British. Calm. Professional. Speaking directly to fighters that shouldn't have known they existed. Becker's head snapped left and right, scanning the empty sky. Nothing. Just darkness, and the faint line where black water met black sky. He checked his altimeter, 200 meters, exactly as briefed. Below radar coverage. Below everything. Yet the British voice continued, steady and precise, calling out positions, altitudes, closing speeds. His pulse hammered against his collar. Then, high above and ahead, he saw them, the blue exhaust flames of Spitfires diving out of the sun that hadn't yet risen, positioned perfectly, impossibly, as if they had been waiting at exactly the right coordinates at exactly the right moment. The ambush was perfect because they had been seen when seeing should have been impossible. In the winter of 1942, the Luftwaffe still believed in certain fundamental truths about aerial warfare. Altitude was sanctuary, darkness was concealment. The curvature of the earth and the limitations of human vision meant that a formation flying low and fast could approach unseen until the moment of attack. These weren't theories, they were facts, proven in Poland, in France, over the Channel, across the Eastern Front. The Jagdflieger, the fighter pilots of the Luftwaffe, were the best trained in the world, and their doctrine was written in the blood of enemies who had learned too late that German pilots owned the sky. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the sky had changed. Across the English coast, in concrete bunkers and improvised stations, in towers and modified vans, a new kind of soldier sat watching green screens pulse with light. They wore headsets instead of helmets. Their weapon was mathematics. The chain-home radar network, crude by later standards but revolutionary in 1940, had evolved. By 1943, new systems, the centimetric radars, the AI Mark 8 airborne intercept sets, the ground-controlled intercept stations formed an invisible net across the approaches to Britain. Where German pilots saw empty darkness, British operators saw glowing blips marching across their scopes, each one a precise coordinate of range, bearing, and altitude. They could see through clouds, through night, through the very tactics that had made the Luftwaffe invincible. The German High Command knew the British had radar. They had their own Freya and Würzburg systems, but there was knowing, and there was understanding. They knew radar existed as a tool for early warning, for detecting high-altitude bomber formations at great distances. They didn't yet understand that it had become a weapon of such precision that a controller on the ground could vector a night fighter onto a target with surgical accuracy, talking him onto an invisible enemy's tail in complete darkness, until the German aircraft appeared in the British pilot's gun sight, like a ghost materializing in moonlight. The Jagdflieger expected to hunt. Instead, for the first time, they were being hunted by mathematics and radio waves, by an enemy who could see the invisible. Becker broke hard left, instinct overriding doctrine. The Spitfires came through his formation like wolves through sheep, their cannons hammering in short, precise bursts. Lieutenant Hoffmann's aircraft exploded in a ball of orange fire that left purple afterimages in Becker's vision. The formation scattered, each pilot screaming into his radio, calling warnings, calling for help, calling out positions that changed every second as they twisted through the sky trying to evade enemies who shouldn't have been there. He dove, pushing the stick forward until the grey water rushed up at him, pulling out so low that spray kicked up from his prop wash. The Spitfire followed. Through his mirror, Becker watched the British fighter match his every move, staying locked in his cone of vulnerability, never firing wildly, waiting for the perfect shot. The British pilot knew exactly where he was. Every evasion, every desperate turn. The enemy followed as if connected by an invisible wire. Then Becker understood. They could see him. Somehow, impossibly, they could see him in the dark. He pulled up hard, the G-forces crushing him into his seat, black spots blooming at the edges of his vision. The Spitfire followed, still tracking, still waiting. Becker's lungs burned. His hands were slick inside his gloves. He had 1,500 hours of combat time. He was an ace, a veteran, a survivor of battles from the Atlantic to the Urals. And he was being toyed with by an enemy who possessed a sense he didn't have, fighting in a dimension he couldn't reach. The cannon rounds that finally found him were almost a relief. The first reports from returning pilots were dismissed. Battle stress, coincidence, exaggeration. The Jagdflieger were the elite, and elites didn't lose to mere technology. But the reports kept coming. Night fighters appearing at perfect intercept angles. Coastal patrols ambushed before they reached their targets. Bomber formations tracked across their entire approach. British fighters waiting at exact altitudes, vectored in with inhuman precision. The pilots used words like supernatural and sorcery. In briefing rooms across occupied France, veteran flight commanders stood before their men unable to explain what was happening. The explanations they had that the British had spotters everywhere, that there must be spies in every squadron, that perhaps the enemy had developed some new secret weapon, all felt hollow. The truth, when German intelligence finally assembled it from captured equipment and interrogated prisoners, was worse than sorcery. It was science. The British had miniaturized radar, mounted it in aircraft, perfected it to the point where a night fighter could track a target through clouds and darkness, where ground stations could paint a picture of the sky in real time, where the entire approach to Britain was covered by an electronic shield that made stealth impossible. The Luftwaffe had been fighting with vision. The British were fighting with second sight. What shattered German pilots wasn't just the tactical surprise, it was the industrial implication. This wasn't one secret weapon. This was an entire system, dozens of radar stations, thousands of operators, specialized aircraft, a doctrine built around technology that required enormous manufacturing capacity, electrical engineering expertise, and coordination between services. The British were supposed to be alone, isolated, bombed to rubble, barely surviving. Instead, they had constructed an invisible fortress in the sky, one that operated 24 hours a day, that improved with each month, that suggested resources and industrial capability that the Luftwaffe's intelligence estimates said shouldn't exist. Then the Americans arrived, and the Germans learned that what the British had built was merely the prototype. March 1944. Luftwaffe Airfield, Saint-Dizier, France. Hauptmann Ernst Vogel stood in the operations room, staring at a map that made less sense each day. Red pins marked Luftwaffe losses. They clustered around certain routes, certain altitudes, certain times. The pattern was clear and terrible. They were being predicted. Every defensive patrol, every intercept mission, every attempt to strike American bomber formations was met with fighter escorts that arrived at exactly the right moment, positioned at exactly the right altitude, with exactly the right energy advantage. The Americans called them Little Friends, the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, that swarmed over Germany in numbers that seemed to grow with each mission. But numbers alone didn't explain it. Vogel had flown against superior numbers before. In Russia, he'd fought outnumbered 10-1 and survived through skill, tactics, and aggression. This was different. The Americans weren't just numerous, they were informed. Their formations didn't search for German fighters, they went directly to them. Their bomber streams didn't get lost or separated. They were shepherded by controllers who could see everything, who could warn of threats before they materialized, who could coordinate attacks across hundreds of kilometers of airspace, as if playing chess with perfect knowledge of every piece. The reports from pilots were consistent and chilling. American bombers flew in boxes combat formations so tight and coordinated that attacking them was like flying into a cloud of steel. Their defensive fire was synchronized, their gunners warned by central fire control systems that calculated lead and deflection angles automatically. And always, when German fighters committed to an attack, the American escorts appeared, diving from above with speed and altitude advantage, positioned perfectly because ground controllers had told them exactly where to be. A young pilot, fresh from training, asked Vogel the question that nobody wanted to answer. How do they see us? Vogel had no good answer. The technical briefings spoke of new American radars, the SCR-584, the SCR-720 airborne sets, systems with range and precision that German equivalents couldn't match. The Americans had H-2X bombing radar that let them strike through clouds, hitting targets they couldn't see with their eyes but could see on their screens. They had radio proximity fuses, shells that exploded automatically when near an aircraft, requiring no direct hit. They had IFF identification friend or foe systems that let their controllers distinguish their own aircraft from enemies automatically, eliminating confusion in the chaotic swirl of air combat. Each technology alone was impressive. Together, they represented something more profound. An American military that treated information as a weapon as important as bombs or bullets, that had industrialized awareness itself. The Jagdflieger had expected many things from their American opponents. They expected courage. The Americans had a reputation for bravery that bordered on recklessness. They expected numbers. American industrial capacity was well known, even feared. They expected heavy bombers in mass formations, flying in daylight, accepting terrible casualties to strike their targets. What they didn't expect was to be technically outclassed. German pilots were trained to believe in their qualitative superiority. One German fighter was worth 3 enemy fighters. German discipline, German tactics, German fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantages. These beliefs were rooted in real experiences. In Poland, in France, in the early years in Russia, German qualitative superiority had been decisive. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 had been the best fighter in the world. German pilots had more training, better tactics, combat experience against multiple enemies. They were professionals facing amateurs. By 1944, that equation had reversed. The American P-51 Mustang wasn't just numerically superior, it was a better aircraft. Faster than the Bf 109, more maneuverable than the Furview 190 at high altitude, with range that let it escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. American pilots arrived with hundreds of hours of training, fully qualified in instrument flying, aerial gunnery, formation tactics. They had so much fuel they could use full throttle in combat without worrying about reserves. They had so much ammunition they could fire long bursts instead of the short, precise shots German pilots were forced to ration. When an American aircraft was damaged, it could be replaced within days. When an American pilot was lost, 2 more arrived to replace him, but the radar was different. The radar meant that German tactical advantages, surprise, positioning, the ability to choose when and where to engage were neutralized before combat even began. A German pilot might have superior situational awareness in a dogfight, better energy management, more accurate shooting. None of it mattered if the American already knew he was coming, already had altitude and speed advantage, already had been positioned by ground controllers who could see the entire battle space on their scopes. The psychological impact was insidious. German pilots began to feel watched, hunted, exposed. The sky that had once been a domain of skill and courage became a killing ground where invisible eyes tracked every movement. Pilots reported a new kind of fear, not the clean fear of combat, but the paranoid sense of being observed by something they couldn't see or fight. Some refused to fly, others flew but held back, breaking off attacks early, unwilling to commit when they knew enemy fighters might already be diving on them from above, vectored in by voices speaking calm coordinates over radios. The Jagdflieger were being broken not by superior courage, but by superior information. and there was no doctrine for fighting that. The 6th of June, 1944. D-Day. The skies over Normandy. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff led his group across the Channel at dawn, flying toward the massive Allied fleet that intelligence said was impossible, but his eyes confirmed was real. The sky above the invasion beaches should have been a target-rich environment, thousands of vulnerable transport aircraft, gliders, bombers at low altitude supporting ground troops. Every German fighter in France had been scrambled. This should have been a slaughter. Instead, Steinhoff's formation was intercepted 60 kilometers from the coast. They came from above and behind P-47 seconds and Spitfires and P-38 seconds, too many to count, positioned perfectly across every approach route. The battle lasted 4 minutes. Steinhoff lost 8 aircraft and never got within sight of the beaches. The survivors limped back to their bases with a story that sounded like madness. The Allies had somehow established complete air superiority over the entire invasion fleet, not through fighting but through coordination so precise that German aircraft were intercepted before they reached their targets, vectored onto by controllers who seemed to have a map of every aircraft in the sky. What Steinhoff didn't know was that the Allied air forces had more than 2,000 radar sets operating over Normandy on D-Day, a density of coverage so complete that even individual aircraft could be tracked continuously from takeoff to landing. The SCR-584 radar units coordinated anti-aircraft fire with such precision that German aircraft flying below 5,000 meters entered a zone of automated death, tracked by systems that calculated firing solutions faster than human gunners could think. Above that altitude, they were meat for fighters directed by controllers, who could vector in reinforcements before a dogfight even began, who could warn their pilots of threats from any direction, who could coordinate attacks by multiple squadrons across 100 kilometers of front as if conducting an orchestra. The Luftwaffe had prepared for a battle. Instead, they flew into a system. In the months after Normandy, as Allied armies pushed across France and Germany itself came under siege, Luftwaffe pilots experienced a strange and demoralizing inversion of their early war experiences. In 1940, they had been the technological elite, flying better aircraft with better radios and better tactics than their enemies. The French and British had courage but were uncoordinated, unable to concentrate their forces, often surprised by German formations that appeared from unexpected directions at unexpected times. The Luftwaffe had owned the information advantage, and that advantage had been decisive. Now that advantage belonged to the enemy, and it was total. American and British fighters didn't patrol randomly, they were positioned. They didn't search for targets, they were vectored. They didn't conserve ammunition or fuel, they had so much abundance that economy was irrelevant. A German pilot might have superior situational awareness in his immediate vicinity, better energy management in a one-on-one engagement. But the Allied pilot knew where every other aircraft within 50 kilometers was located, had controllers warning him of threats before they appeared, could call in reinforcements that would arrive in minutes with perfect positioning. It was like fighting blind against an opponent who could see, fighting deaf against an opponent who could hear every word spoken. The symbolic weight of this reversal was crushing. The Luftwaffe had been built on Prussian military tradition, skill, discipline, courage, the individual warrior's excellence. These values were supposed to overcome material disadvantages. The Allies, particularly the Americans, were supposedly rich but soft, dependent on machines and mass production because they lacked fighting spirit. The radar revealed that assumption as propaganda and wishful thinking. The Americans had fighting spirit, their pilots were as brave and aggressive as any German ace. But they also had systems, coordination, technology, and industrial capacity that made individual heroism more effective rather than replacing it. A Luftwaffe pilot might shoot down 3 enemy fighters in a single mission and still lose the battle because the enemy could replace those 3 fighters the same day, because the enemy had controllers who had already vectored 6 more fighters to his location, because the enemy had radar-directed anti-aircraft fire that would bracket his altitude the moment he descended to strafe targets. Excellence wasn't enough when the enemy had excellence and abundance. September 1944. interrogation center, somewhere in England. Hauptmann Vogel sat across from an American intelligence officer, answering questions about Luftwaffe tactics and capabilities. He had been shot down over France, his aircraft crippled by a P-51 that had appeared as they always did, at exactly the right moment from exactly the right direction. The American officer was courteous, professional, offering cigarettes and hot coffee, more interested in technical details than propaganda. After an hour of questions about fighter tactics and radar countermeasures, the American asked something unexpected. "What surprised you most about fighting us?" Vogel considered the question while smoking, remembering that morning over the North Sea, when his entire understanding of aerial warfare had shattered. He thought about the reports that kept coming in about perfect intercepts, about missions scrubbed because Allied fighters were already waiting at the target, about the gradual realization that the Luftwaffe was fighting an enemy who possessed a sensory advantage that couldn't be overcome through courage or skill. "We expected you to be rich," Vogel said finally. "We knew about your factories, your production numbers. We thought we understood what we were facing. What we didn't understand was that you had made the invisible visible. We trained to fight other pilots. You built a system where pilots were pieces in a larger machine, where the machine itself could see and think and coordinate. We had nothing like it. Even if we had captured all your radar equipment, built identical systems, we couldn't have operated them. We didn't have the electrical engineers, the operators, the doctrine, the mindset. You didn't just build better technology, you built a military that thought differently about warfare itself." The American officer nodded, writing notes. "Did you ever think you could win?" "Until the radar. Yes," Vogel answered. "Even outnumbered, even outproduced, we believed that skill and determination would be enough. The radar taught us that modern warfare isn't about individual combat anymore. It's about systems and information. You can be the best pilot in the world, but if the enemy knows where you are and you don't know where he is, you're just a target." That was the lesson. The technical specifications of Allied radar systems in 1944 would seem primitive by later standards. The chain-home stations could detect aircraft at ranges up to 200 kilometers, but with poor altitude resolution. The SCR 584 was accurate, but required a trained crew of 5 operators. The AI Mark 8 airborne intercept radar had a maximum range of only 9 kilometers and was useless against targets below the aircraft. By modern standards, these were crude instruments, requiring skilled operators, constant maintenance, vulnerable to countermeasures and weather interference. But in the context of 1944, they represented a revolution as significant as the introduction of aircraft themselves. For the first time in history, a military force could know with reasonable accuracy where every friendly and enemy unit in a battle space was located in real time. Commanders could coordinate forces across hundreds of kilometers of front as if they were all standing on a single battlefield. Fighters could be guided onto targets they couldn't see by controllers who could. Bombers could strike through clouds and darkness with accuracy that would have been impossible with visual navigation alone. The Germans developed countermeasures aluminum chaff called Dupel to confuse radar screens, electronic jammers, tactics for flying low or in bad weather to avoid detection. Some worked temporarily, but the fundamental equation remained unchanged. The Allies could see, and the Germans could not see as clearly. Every countermeasure was met with a counter-countermeasure, every tactic with an adaptation. The technological race was real, but one side was running uphill with limited resources, while the other had effectively unlimited industrial capacity to throw at the problem. A single American radar set represented thousands of hours of engineering, precision, manufacturing, electronic components that required specialized factories and rare materials. The Americans deployed them by the thousands. They equipped entire bomber groups with H-2X radar, installed AI sets in hundreds of night fighters, built networks of ground stations that provided overlapping coverage. When equipment failed, it was replaced. When new models became available, old models were relegated to training or secondary missions. The Germans couldn't produce enough radar sets to equip their most critical units, couldn't replace losses, couldn't keep pace with the rate of Allied innovation. It wasn't just technology. It was the industrial and educational system that could produce that technology at scale, the military doctrine that could employ it effectively, the economic foundation that made it all possible. December 1944. The Ardennes Offensive. For a brief moment, German forces broke through Allied lines in Belgium, creating confusion and chaos, threatening to split the Allied armies. The weather was terrible: low clouds, snow, fog. The kind of weather that grounded aircraft and neutralized Allied air superiority. For 3 days, the Luftwaffe achieved something resembling parity in the skies over the battlefield, flying close support missions, attacking supply columns, providing cover for advancing panzers. German pilots tasted what they remembered from earlier years: the ability to operate without constant fear of enemies appearing from nowhere, missions where skill and aggression mattered more than being on the right side of the technological divide. Then the weather cleared. Within hours, the sky filled with Allied aircraft, bombers hitting supply routes, fighters strafing German columns, reconnaissance planes reporting every movement back to controllers who vectored in attacks with surgical precision. The brief window of opportunity closed with mechanical inevitability. German pilots found themselves back in the familiar nightmare, intercepted before reaching targets, tracked by radar, overwhelmed by enemies who always seemed to have altitude and position advantage. The offensive stalled, then collapsed, and the Luftwaffe lost hundreds of aircraft in desperate missions that accomplished nothing except adding names to casualty lists. A Luftwaffe pilot who survived the Ardennes wrote in his diary, "We flew into hell. The Americans and British were everywhere, always exactly where we didn't want them to be, as if they were reading our minds. We lost 12 aircraft from my Gruppe in 1 week. Not in dramatic dogfights, but in brief, brutal encounters where we were ambushed before we knew they were there. This is not warfare. This is extermination conducted with industrial efficiency. We are not fighting an enemy. We are fighting a machine that processes us, like a factory processes raw materials." The story of radar in World War II is not primarily a story of German technological failure. German scientists understood the principles of radio detection. German engineers built functional radar systems: the Freya early warning radar, the Würzburg fire control radar, the Liechtenstein airborne intercept system. In some areas, German research was actually more advanced than Allied equivalents. The problem wasn't knowledge or capability. The problem was priority, resources, and doctrine. Germany entered the war as a continental power focused on rapid, decisive campaigns. Radar was developed as a defensive tool, useful for protecting the homeland but secondary to offensive weapons. German industry, even before the war, was smaller than American or combined Allied industry. When resources became scarce, they went to tanks, submarines, fighter aircraft, weapons that could kill the enemy directly. Radar was support equipment, important but not critical. The doctrine assumed that superior German training and tactics would overcome Allied material advantages. By the time German military leadership recognized that assumption was fatally wrong, resources were too scarce to build radar networks on the scale the Allies had deployed. The Americans and British, fighting an air war over their own territory and then across vast oceans, understood from the beginning that they needed to see before they could strike. They invested enormous resources in radar development, not as a side project, but as a critical war-winning technology. They built dedicated factories for radar components, trained thousands of operators, developed doctrine that made radar central to air operations rather than supplementary. When German bombers struck Britain in 1940, radar wasn't an experimental technology, it was the core of the entire defensive system. By 1944, the disparity was so vast that comparison became meaningless. The Allies had integrated radar into every aspect of air operations: navigation, bombing, interception, ground-controlled approach for landing, ship detection, submarine hunting, even proximity fuses for anti-aircraft shells. Radar wasn't a tool, it was the nervous system of the entire military organism. The Germans had radar sets. The Allies had a radar culture. The final months of the war saw German pilots flying missions that were suicidal in all but name. The Me-262 jet fighter, technologically superior to any Allied aircraft, was rendered nearly useless because Allied radar tracked them from takeoff to landing, vectoring in fighters to attack them when they were most vulnerable, climbing after takeoff or descending to land. German pilots reported being intercepted within minutes of becoming airborne, as if the enemy had been waiting for them specifically. Allied intelligence had identified every Luftwaffe airfield in Germany, monitored them constantly with radar and reconnaissance, maintained standing patrols of fighters positioned to intercept German aircraft during their most vulnerable moments. The Me-262 could outrun any Allied fighter, but only at altitude with speed already built up. Climbing from a runway, it was as vulnerable as any other aircraft, and Allied tactics adapted instantly to exploit that vulnerability. Radar made those tactics possible without it. Maintaining standing patrols over every German airfield would have been prohibitively expensive and inefficient. The psychological toll on surviving German pilots was documented in post-war interviews. Many described a feeling of helplessness, of being hunted by an omniscient enemy who could not be evaded or surprised. Combat is terrifying, but combat has logic. If you're skilled, careful, and lucky, you can survive. Being hunted by radar felt like fighting fate itself, like every mission was predetermined to fail because the enemy knew what you would do before you did it. Some pilots cracked under the strain, refusing to fly or developing psychosomatic symptoms. Others flew with a kind of fatalistic resignation, going through the motions because orders required it, but no longer believing that skill or courage made any difference. The Jagdflieger, who had once owned the sky, ended the war as fugitives in it, flying low through valleys to avoid radar coverage, taking off in bad weather when Allied aircraft were grounded, operating at night when their lack of effective radar made them more vulnerable, but at least gave them a chance of surprise. They had become guerrillas in their own airspace, using the tactics of the weak against an enemy whose strength was not just material but informational. There is a photograph from May 1945, taken at a captured Luftwaffe airfield in Germany. American soldiers stand among rows of German aircraft, W-190 seconds, Bf-109 seconds, even a few. Me-262 jets, all intact, all fueled and armed, but abandoned by pilots who had no chance of taking off without being immediately tracked and destroyed. The aircraft themselves were technologically sophisticated, some of them superior to Allied equivalents, but they were useless without the system to employ them effectively, without the fuel to fly them in numbers, without the radar to coordinate them, without the industrial base to replace losses. The photograph could serve as a metaphor for the larger strategic picture. Germany had technology, courage, tactical skill. What it didn't have, what it could never have matched, was the American ability to turn industrial capacity into military systems, to mass-produce not just weapons, but entire integrated networks of sensors, communications, doctrine, and training. The radar was just the most visible expression of that deeper advantage. American abundance wasn't just about building more aircraft or more tanks. It was about building redundancy, building systems with overlapping capabilities, building a military where the loss of any individual component didn't degrade the whole. A German pilot shot down represented months of irreplaceable training, years of combat experience, often decades of institutional knowledge. An American pilot shot down was a tragedy for his family, but statistically irrelevant to the war effort. 2 more were already in the pipeline, trained to the same standard, ready to fly the same missions. A German radar station destroyed was a gap in coverage that might never be filled. An American radar station destroyed was replaced within weeks, often by a newer model with better capabilities. The war became an equation where German qualitative advantages were divided by Allied quantitative and systemic advantages, and the result approached zero as the war progressed. In the summer of 1945, after Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence teams interviewed surviving Luftwaffe commanders about their experiences fighting the Allied air campaign. One question appeared repeatedly in the interrogation reports: when did you know the war was lost? The answers varied. Some pointed to Stalingrad, or the failure to destroy the RAF in 1940, or the entry of the United States into the war. But a significant number mentioned a specific moment of realization connected to radar and air operations, the moment when they understood that Allied air superiority wasn't temporary or local but total and permanent, that no tactical innovation or strategic adjustment could overcome an enemy who possessed such complete informational awareness of the battlefield. General Feldmarschall Hugo Sperle, commander of Luftwaffe 3, told his interrogators, "We knew we were outnumbered. We expected that. We believed that superior German training and discipline would allow us to inflict disproportionate casualties, to make the cost of victory too high for the Allies to accept. What we discovered was that the Allies had made our advantages irrelevant. They didn't need to be better pilots, they just needed to always know where we were while we didn't know where they were. That was the decisive factor. Everything else was consequence." Another officer, speaking anonymously, was more blunt. "You Americans didn't just beat us. You made our way of warfare obsolete. We trained individual warriors. You built a machine where individual skill mattered less than systematic coordination. We couldn't adapt, because adaptation would have required rebuilding our entire military culture, our industrial base, our educational system. By the time we understood what was happening, we had already lost. The radar was just the symbol of something larger, your ability to industrialize warfare itself to a degree we couldn't match even if we had possessed equivalent resources. Which we didn't. The technological advantage represented by radar was, in the end, an expression of a deeper philosophical and industrial divide. The American military was built on a fundamentally different model than the German one, less emphasis on producing individual elite warriors, more emphasis on creating systems where average soldiers operating good equipment with good coordination could defeat excellent soldiers operating in isolation. The radar networks were expensive, required enormous logistical support, depended on complex supply chains for maintenance and operation. They were, in that sense, very American, sophisticated, expensive, dependent on industrial abundance, but devastatingly effective when employed at scale. The German military tradition valued individual excellence, skill passed from veteran to novice, tactics refined through generations of military culture. In previous wars, those values had been decisive, but World War II, particularly the Air War, revealed the limitation of that model when facing an enemy who could mass-produce capability itself, who could create systems where average operators achieved above-average results because the system compensated for individual limitations. A German pilot needed hundreds of hours of training to achieve proficiency in instrument flying, navigation, and aerial combat. An American pilot received that same training, but was also part of a system that reduced the cognitive load on him. Ground controllers who provided navigation assistance, radar operators who warned of threats, standardized procedures that made formation flying safer, radios in every aircraft that allowed real-time coordination. The German pilot might be more skilled individually, but the American pilot was more effective because he wasn't operating alone. The radar made that system possible. Without it, the coordination advantages would have been dramatically reduced. Coordination requires information, and radar provided that information in quantities and at speeds that human observers could never match. On a cold morning in April 1945, one of the last Luftwaffe sorties over Germany took place. 3 FU 190 seconds, flown by veterans with years of combat experience, attempted to intercept a formation of B-17 bombers striking a communications center. They were detected on radar while still climbing from their airfield, tracked across their entire approach, and intercepted by P-51 seconds that had been vectored onto them before the German pilots even saw the bomber formation. The engagement lasted 90 seconds. 2 German aircraft were destroyed. The third escaped by diving to treetop level and flying erratically, below the effective coverage of ground radar, using terrain masking to break the track. The pilot landed at a different airfield with 20 liters of fuel remaining and damage from ground fire. In his mission report, recovered after the war, the pilot wrote a single sentence of commentary. "We are fighting ghosts who see us while we are blind." That sentence could serve as the epitaph for the Luftwaffe's experience fighting the Allied air campaign. The war in the air was decided not primarily by courage or skill. Both sides had those qualities in abundance, but by a systematic advantage in awareness and coordination that rendered traditional martial virtues insufficient. The Germans fought with the tools and doctrines of warfare as it had been understood for centuries. The Allies, particularly the Americans, fought with the tools and doctrines of warfare as it would be understood for the next century, information-centric, systems-dependent, reliant on technological integration rather than individual heroism. The radar was the herald of that new reality. It arrived quietly, almost invisibly, just green traces on cathode ray tubes in darkened rooms, radio voices speaking coordinates, mathematical calculations converting electromagnetic reflections into targeting data. It didn't announce itself with dramatic demonstrations of power like the atomic bomb. But in its own way, it was equally revolutionary, equally transformative of the nature of warfare itself. The German pilots who flew into that radar-illuminated sky expected to fight other pilots in contests of skill and courage. Instead, they found themselves fighting an entire system, one that saw them coming from beyond the horizon, that coordinated responses across hundreds of kilometers, that turned the sky itself into a weapon against them. They were speechless not because they lacked words, but because the words they had honor, skill, courage, determination, had become insufficient to describe or overcome what they faced. They were warriors confronting the future, and the future fought with invisible weapons that struck before the enemy could be seen. In that confrontation, the old certainties of warfare dissolved, leaving only the cold mathematics of detection range, intercept vectors, and systematic coordination. The age of the individual ace was ending, replaced by the age of the integrated network. The radar was the messenger of that transition, and the message it carried was written in the wreckage of aircraft, flown by pilots who had learned too late that being the best was no longer enough when the enemy could see through darkness itself.